an energy crisis, a climate crisis, and an identity crisis. Europe's economy is at a turning point.
I think Europe actually is pretty good at, when we have a bit of a crisis, to do something with it. It's sad maybe that you need to do it, but I think that's just part of reality.
As the war continues to rage in Ukraine, European leaders are facing the challenge of a life.
The military regime in Niger has, with immediate effect, banned the export of uranium to France. Over 50% of the uranium ore extracted from Niger is used for fueling French nuclear power plants. 24% of EU uranium imports come from Niger.
Now we have this completely different situation now, where Europe is flipped on its head. What's the strongest economy in Europe right now? It's probably Spain or Portugal. Italy is doing very well. What's the weakest economy? I would argue it's probably on the economic side, it's Germany. On the political side, it's France. So Germany, your biggest traditionally monetary hawk, actually needs lower rates. And then France, which is this usually balancing force, is a complete mess. And I think we can.
Many countries in the north count their assets in the mineral resources that are beneath the African soil. The wealth of Africa belongs to Africans. Centuries after the end of the slave trade, decades after the end of the colonial exploitation of Africa's resources, the people of our continent are once again bearing the cost of industrialization of the North and the development of the wealthy nations of the world. This is a price that the people of Africa are no longer prepared to pay. Many countries in the North count their assets in the mineral resources that are beneath the African soil. The wealth of Africa belongs to Africans. The mineral wealth that is beneath the soil of Africa must, in the end, accrue to Africans. We urge global leaders to accelerate the global decarbonization while pursuing equality and shared prosperity. We need to advance all three pillars of the Paris Agreement: mitigation, adaptation, and support, with equal ambition and urgency.
Significant slowdown. There's little upturn expected in the short term. The government's Economic Advisory Panel is predicting growth of just 0.2% this year.
One reason for Germany's economic weakness: a drop in exports. The demand for German cars and machines from abroad has dropped.
In this era of global uncertainty, Africa must exercise sovereignty over its natural resources to raise the necessary funds to ensure the well-being of its citizens. The days of parceling out vast concession areas to foreign interests for exploitation must come to an end. We'll continue to welcome foreign investment, but we must negotiate better for a bigger share of the natural resources that belong to us. And we must insist on value addition to these resources. We're tired of the continued image of poverty-stricken, disease-ridden rural communities living at the periphery of huge foreign-controlled natural resource concession areas. We're tired of having people extract the most they can from us and in return offer us the very least by way of respect, consideration, and dignity. We're tired of not being represented in ways that reveal the richness and complexity of our history or acknowledge all that we have overcome to arrive here in this liminal space of
an area after years of waiting to do so. However, in recent months, Romania has also found itself in deep trouble with Brussels after its public deficit ballooned to over 9% of GDP last year, the highest level in the EU by quite some margin, and 3 times the level considered fiscally safe. Then this summer, Romania only narrowly escaped being locked out.
Unless there is a plan to go and live on Mars, we do not have a choice. And I hope that this convocation and conversation can take place within the next 4 to 8 weeks. We cannot go to the world's population again making promises and yet saying that this is the most urgent problem facing mankind.
Straight that Africa should never be seen as a continent that needs generosity. We want to be treated as equals.
We cannot achieve what we want to achieve if we allow our global community to focus time, resources, everything, technology, on conflict. I think there's a duty for us all to keep our individual countries peaceful, out of conflict, and not export instability to other countries, neighboring or far away.
The warning signs had been quietly building for years, but Europe had been too distracted to notice. Meetings in Brussels were filled with confident assurances that supply chains were secure, partnerships were stable, and global markets would always bend in Europe's favor. And yet, as the months passed, subtle tremors rippled across. Critical sectors, battery manufacturers whispered about delays, aerospace officials complained of sudden price surges. Tech companies struggled to explain to investors why their timelines were slipping. Something had shifted, but no one dared to call it what it truly was: the beginning of a crisis that Europe had never imagined possible. It all began when several African nations, long frustrated by a legacy of unequal trade, quietly formed a new economic framework. They did not use fanfare or public declarations. Instead, they met behind closed doors in conference halls in Addis Ababa, Kigali, and Accra. The discussions were direct. Africa possessed some of the world's most valuable minerals: cobalt, lithium, manganese, copper, rare earth elements, and yet the continents all little real benefit from the industries built on these resources. For decades, European countries had enjoyed low-cost access through old agreements that heavily favored former colonial powers. Now those agreements were reaching their end. Africa's leaders had grown tired of exporting raw materials at bargain prices only for Europe to profit from processing, manufacturing, and innovation. As global competition intensified, Africa's leverage increased. China had already built deep ties on the continent, offering infrastructure, loans, and technology in exchange for long-term mineral security. The United States was rushing to expand its presence, desperate to reduce dependence on Beijing. Russia was joining the race as well, forging military and commercial alliances with mineral-rich states. For the first time in modern history, Africa was at the center of a global tug-of-war. European officials watched these developments with mild concern but not alarm. They believed that Africa, despite its growing influence, would never risk cutting mineral exports. Europe was their traditional partner, their long-term ally, their natural market. The speeches carried a familiar tone of entitlement and assumption that Africa would always choose Europe above all others. But Africa was changing, its economies were rising, its youth population was becoming more politically conscious, its governments were increasingly assertive, and in the background, a new confidence was spreading across the continent, the recognition that Africa could rewrite its role in the global system. The turning point came when several mineral-rich African nations unveiled a unified export strategy at a quiet gathering in Lusaka. Under this agreement, critical minerals, particularly those essential for electric vehicles, renewable energy technologies, and advanced electronics, would no longer leave the continent unprocessed. Instead, African nations demanded that foreign partners build manufacturing plants on African soil, create local jobs, transfer technology, and pay prices that reflected the true value of the resources. Europe, accustomed to preferential access, found itself blindsided. The first shock hit the European electric vehicle sector. Automakers in Germany, France, Italy, and Sweden suddenly faced shortages of cobalt and lithium. Their factories, once symbols of efficiency, began operating below capacity. Assembly lines slowed, investors grew nervous, and Europe's dream of dominating the global EV industry began to slip away. Publicly, European leaders insisted that the situation was temporary, a minor interruption that would soon be resolved. Privately, they panicked. Reports circulated across ministries warning that Europe had dangerously underestimated Africa's strategic power. For decades, Europe believed its technological superiority would protect its economic dominance. Now, that superiority meant nothing without the minerals needed to produce batteries, sensors, chips, and renewable energy systems. The second shock came from the aerospace and defense sectors. These industries relied heavily on rare earth elements sourced from Africa. When exports were reduced, manufacturers found themselves unable to meet contractual deadlines, fighter jet programs stalled, satellite projects were delayed. Defense officials sounded the alarm, fearing that Europe's security capabilities were becoming dangerously vulnerable. It was a wake-up call that rattled even the most confident policymakers. Then came the third blow. disruptions to the tech industry. Consumer electronics producers across Europe struggled to maintain production. The shortages were not catastrophic yet, but they were enough to expose how deeply Europe depended on Africa. European media outlets began running headlines with phrases like critical shortage, supply chain strain, and unexpected vulnerability. Commentators debated how Europe could have let itself become so reliant without preparing for alternatives. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere in Brussels grew tense. Officials from different EU nations blamed one another. Some accused the continent of ignoring warnings about overdependence on foreign minerals. Others argued that Europe had assumed Africa would never push back because of decades-old political ties. A few quietly admitted what no one wanted to say publicly. Europe had underestimated Africa's unity and determination. As the crisis unfolded, African nations remained firm. They refused to bow to pressure or reverse their decision. Instead, they reiterated their conditions: fair prices, local processing, manufacturing partnerships, and a new model of cooperation that ended exploitative trade patterns. The message was clear: Africa was no longer willing to be the world's mineral warehouse. The global reaction was swift. China praised Africa's decision, seeing an opportunity to strengthen its already robust partnerships. The United States expressed concerns, urging negotiations but also signaling willingness to invest more deeply in African economies. Russia offered military cooperation in exchange for mineral access. For the first time, Africa was being courted not as a dependent region but as a geopolitical powerhouse. And yet Europe found itself standing on uncertain ground. Old influence no longer carried weight. Historical ties no longer guaranteed cooperation. Economic pressure no longer produced automatic compliance. The continent that Europe once viewed through a paternalistic lens had now asserted itself as an equal and, in some ways, a superior player in the global mineral game. European leaders scrambled to respond. Emergency delegations were sent to capitals across Africa. Negotiators attempted to revive old agreements, offering minor concessions, while expecting major gains. But Africa was no longer interested in symbolic gestures. It wanted real change, real investment, real respect. Europe, for the first time in decades, realized it was not negotiating from a position of strength. It was reacting desperate, unprepared, and facing a crisis it had never expected. The scramble in Europe deepened as the continent moved from denial to frantic contingency planning. What had begun as a diplomatic irritation was now a full-blown supply shock with cascading consequences. Factories idled, inventories ran thin, and whole industrial strategies built around secure access to Africa's minerals needed emergency revision. European capitals convened crisis councils, but the options on the table were limited: appease African demands, accelerate expensive domestic mining projects, or compete with Asian and Middle Eastern bidders prepared to meet Africa's new terms. None of these alternatives promised immediate relief. The European automotive sector felt the pressure first and most visibly. Germany's production hubs, France's battery ambitions, and Italy's component suppliers all relied heavily on steady shipments of lithium, cobalt, and graphite, with African exports curtailed. Assembly plants faced brutal downtimes. Suppliers scrambled to reroute materials from other continents, but logistical bottlenecks and geopolitical competition made rapid substitution impossible. Investment funds that had poured billions into European EV supply chains saw valuations plummet, and boards demanded emergency strategies to preserve market share. The result was public anxiety and private panic. Investors began pricing in prolonged shortages and higher production costs. Energy and utilities faced a parallel crisis. Several European countries had planned rapid transitions to renewables supported by African-sourced metals for grid-scale batteries and wind turbine magnets. Now procurement teams faced contracts that could be delayed by months or cancelled entirely. Energy companies warned regulators that timelines for decarbonization would slip, potentially increasing reliance on imported fossil fuels and exposing consumers to volatile price swings. Governments found themselves balancing anger at African policy with the immediate need to keep lights on and factories running. Defense circles raised alarms that transcended economics. Key components for advanced electronics and guidance systems depended on rare earths and specialty alloys increasingly processed within Africa. Military procurement schedules fell into disarray as manufacturers notified defense ministries of delivery risks. In response, some European states revisited strategic stockpiles and accelerated domestic recycling programs for critical components, but these measures were stopgaps. The reality was stark: technological edge depended on materials that now flowed under new political conditions beyond Europe's easy reach. European diplomatic strategy fractured under pressure. Traditional partners pushed for hardline responses, sanctions, trade restrictions, and legal challenges, while others urged negotiation and investment. France and Germany, historically influential in African affairs, advocated a mix of incentives and conditional access, proposing joint industrial projects that promised local processing and employment. Yet African leaders, buoyed by support from Asia and the Gulf, made clear they would accept nothing less than real industrial partnerships with meaningful technology transfer and ownership. European proposals framed as generous were often seen in African capitals as attempts to preserve an inequitable status quo. Financial contagion added urgency. Stock markets reacted to supply disruptions, and insurers revised risk models for long-term contracts tied to African minerals. European banks that had financed mining operations faced write-downs as contracts were renegotiated or postponed. Pension funds and sovereign investors reevaluated exposure to industries that now carried geopolitical risk premiums. The result was a recalibration of risk across portfolios, with capital migrating toward regions perceived as more secure or flexible in accommodating Africa's new export framework. A political backlash emerged across Europe's electorates. Opposition parties used the crisis to criticize incumbent governments for complacency and poor foresight. Labor unions decried factory closures and the loss of high-value manufacturing jobs. Populist movements weaponized public anxiety, framing the crisis as evidence of a decline in European strategic autonomy. Leaders in Brussels attempted to unite the bloc, proposing a European mineral security initiative to coordinate procurement, incentivize domestic processing, and support sustainable mining projects within Europe. The program met resistance. Some member states argued it was too costly, others feared the political implications of accelerated resource extraction at home. In industry, adaptation strategies multiplied. Some firms tried to accelerate reclamation and urban mining, recovering critical metals from end-of-life electronics. Others diversified supply chains to include Latin America and Australia, but these regions lacked the sheer volume or cost profile that Africa had offered. Investment in recycling, substitution research, and alternative chemistries became immediate priorities. Universities and research institutes received emergency funding to develop battery technologies less dependent on the most constrained minerals. The scientific community responded rapidly, yet breakthroughs would take years, not months. Meanwhile, private capital responded to the opening in unexpected ways. Asian conglomerates and Gulf sovereign funds increased bids for African processing projects, offering rapid timelines and favorable financing that Europe could not match. This inflow reinforced Africa's negotiating position and deepened the continent's industrial pivot. European firms that failed to secure early-stage equity in African value chain projects found themselves shut out, paying premium prices later or losing market access entirely. Logistics and shipping lanes adapted as well. Ports and railheads in North Africa and Southern Africa increasingly prioritized shipments tied to new regional processing and manufacturing hubs. Europe's maritime firms discovered a reshaped map of cargo flows that favored east-west corridors and shorter intra-African routes, supporting local assembly. The shift reduced Europe's historic leverage over shipping patterns and increased the importance of new logistics nodes that aligned with African industrial policy. Environmental and ethical debates rose to the fore. Europe had long criticized mining practices abroad, citing labor and ecological standards. With African nations demanding asset-based partnerships and local capacity building, European companies found that aligning with Africa's terms required a simultaneous recommitment to sustainable practices on the continent. Some firms used this as an opportunity to build genuine, high-standard projects that combined social investment with industrial returns. Others saw the demands as cost-prohibitive and withdrew, further narrowing Europe's influence. As the crisis matured, a sober realization took root among European strategists. The continent's long era of resource advantage was over. Historical ties and diplomatic leverage no longer translated into automatic access. Africa's insistence on processing, technology transfer, and ownership represented a long-term shift rather than a temporary bargaining chip. Europe faced a strategic choice: adapt to a new model of partnership on Africa's terms or accept a gradual erosion of its industrial base. In response, a coalition of European states launched an ambitious multi-year plan focused on 3 pillars: accelerate domestic recovery and recycling of critical materials, invest in long-term high-trust industrial partnerships that genuinely transferred technology to Africa, and build a European strategic reserve of processed materials. The plan required massive public and private investment, swift regulatory alignment across the bloc, and a humility rarely admitted in official discourse. Europe would have to compete on Africa's terms, not expect deference. Africa's leaders watched Europe scrambling with a mix of vindication and caution. They had achieved leverage after decades of structural disadvantage, but they were also keenly aware that mismanagement could provoke destabilizing responses. For the moment, however, the continent's posture remained firm. The age of raw export dependency was over, and industries that wanted access to Africa's resources needed to contribute to the continent's industrial future. The crisis served as a brutal lesson. Geopolitical assumptions based on historical privilege had no place in a world where resource owners demanded fairness and agency. Europe's scramble revealed how quickly dependency could translate into vulnerability, and how rapidly global capital and industry would shift toward partners who respected the new rules of value creation. The scramble was not a moment but a marker of a longer era, one in which Europe would have to reinvent its industrial strategy or risk watching its manufacturing decline at the hands of a more assertive and unified Africa. As the crisis deepened, the third phase of Europe's unraveling began, one defined not by panic alone but by a profound reckoning with how global power had changed. The mineral shock exposed cracks not only in Europe's industrial system but also in its philosophical understanding of the world. The old assumptions that Africa would always be a supplier of raw materials, that Europe would always be the primary destination, that diplomatic pressure would always guarantee access were gone. In their place stood a new geopolitical reality built not on deference but on negotiation, sovereignty, and industrial ambition. Africa was no longer waiting for permission. It was setting the rules. In Brussels, emergency roundtables turned into strategic seminars. Consultants, think tanks, and former diplomats presented grim projections. The longer the export restrictions lasted, the more permanent the changes would become. Industrial relocation, once feared as a hypothetical scenario, was happening. Asian and Middle Eastern investors were not just absorbing supplies but building entire ecosystems, processing plants, battery factories, shipping corridors directly inside Africa. This meant that even if Europe regained access someday, it would be entering an Africa-centered market rather than a Europe-dependent one. The automotive sector became the most dramatic illustration of this shift. European companies that had dominated global electric vehicle production now found themselves outpaced by brands with vertically integrated supply chains reaching deep into African mines and refineries. Factories that once powered Europe's export economy were forced to slow production lines or idle them completely as the price of key minerals soared, layoffs increased, governments intervened with subsidies and energy relief plans, but without the raw materials, cash alone could not restart output. The European public, once assured that the shift to green mobility would create millions of jobs, now questioned why their industries had been allowed to build entire futures on resources not under their control. Meanwhile, African capitals showed little interest in reversing course. They were aggressively negotiating with partners who offered more than rhetoric. China's state-owned enterprises proposed multi-decade industrial partnerships combining mineral access with infrastructure, energy projects, and training programs. Gulf investors offered financing for integrated logistics corridors, making it possible for minerals to be processed and exported straight from African factories to Asian and Latin American markets. Even Russia and Brazil joined the new commercial courtship, seeking strategic footholds in the African value chain. Europe, once accustomed to being a preferred partner, was suddenly one bidder among many. African media portrayed Europe's distress as overdue justice. Commentators highlighted the patchwork of colonial extractions and lopsided contracts that had drained local wealth for generations. Now, African ministers spoke openly of industrial liberation, a phase where the continent would no longer settle for single-digit margins. While foreign corporations built empires off its resources, their message was clear: Africa would supply the world, but only on terms that ensured domestic transformation. Europe's political class faced increasing internal division. Some leaders called for cooperation, arguing that Europe needed to apologize, reset, and build new partnerships rooted in mutual respect. Others pushed for a more confrontational approach, pressuring African governments through sanctions, trade barriers, or NATO-backed diplomatic leverage. But any attempt to strong-arm African countries risked pushing them further toward rival economic blocs. Energy independence became another flashpoint. Without critical minerals, Europe's renewable energy transition slowed dramatically, threatening its 2030 climate targets. Countries that had shut down nuclear and coal plants now reconsidered those decisions. Some even revived negotiations for fossil fuel imports from Africa. because they lacked access to the very minerals required to build the renewable technologies that were meant to replace fossil fuels. The irony was not lost on global observers. The continent that once lectured the world about sustainability was now being forced to retrace its steps due to its failure to secure a fair partnership with the resource holders. Financial markets responded brutally. European currencies weakened as investors priced in long-term structural decline. Shipping fees, insurance premiums, and contract costs surged. Commodity traders who once dictated terms to African suppliers now chased any available stock, bidding up prices until even wealthy governments struggled to compete. Hedge funds profited from the chaos, betting on Africa's new leverage and Europe's declining industrial capacity. For many European citizens, inflation was no longer an abstract macroeconomic concern, it was living reality. The crisis also reshaped alliances. Countries like Germany and Spain began pushing for a European-African industrial compact, while others like Poland and Hungary resisted, prioritizing domestic mining and nationalist industrial strategies instead of cooperative models. The lack of unity in Brussels allowed external players to navigate Europe more effectively than Europe could navigate Africa. Back in Africa, the result was profound confidence. New policy frameworks were introduced to ensure local ownership of mineral wealth. Host countries began requiring that at least 40-60% of all minerals be processed domestically before export. They demanded joint ventures in which African governments or private firms retained equity stakes. Corporate tax holidays were replaced with infrastructure for access swaps. These policies brought short-term friction, but long-term structural gains, and this time Africa had the leverage to enforce them. The mineral crisis also sparked a cultural shift. For decades, Africa had been treated as a source of raw materials and humanitarian narratives. Now it was treated as an economic actor with bargaining power. Young Africans watched their leaders negotiate from a position of strength. Analysts from Lagos, Nairobi, Addis Ababa, and Johannesburg were invited onto global panels not as case studies but as experts. The psychological shift was as significant as the political one. Europe's scramble eventually gave way to reluctant adaptation. European officials quietly resumed negotiations, this time offering access not in exchange for raw minerals but in exchange for joint industrial development. Investment funds that had once focused exclusively on extraction now began investing in African universities, energy grids, and manufacturing clusters not out of charity, but because that was the only way to remain relevant in a new global structure. The most startling transformation occurred within Africa's regional organizations. The crisis accelerated their integration. One bloc established a shared mineral pricing mechanism. Another coordinated export quotas. A third began developing an African mineral exchange market intended to replace London, Brussels, and Chicago as the price-setting hubs for key resources. For the first time in modern history, Africa was not merely participating in global trade, it was shaping it. What Europe initially saw as a crisis was, in truth, the emergence of a new world. Power was no longer held by those with factories, diplomats, and stock markets alone, it was held by those who controlled indispensable resources and had the political maturity to leverage them. And Africa had finally claimed that role. What began as a mineral export cut had become a geopolitical earthquake, one that forced Europe to recognize a truth it had ignored for decades. Africa was no longer a continent waiting for development. It was a continent actively defining the future.